delighted to introduce our speakers today, architect, curator and scholar Eyal Weizman, who's published widely, no least his most recent book, The Least of All Possible Evils, which we will be discussing today. He's also a founding member of the collective Decolonizing Architecture Art Residency in Bethlehem, and is Professor of Spatial and Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths, where he directs the Center for Research Architecture. And Susan Schuppli, an artist and cultural theorist. Her creative projects have been exhibited at the Kitchen in New York, the Brussels Biennial, and most recently in the Museum London in Canada. Schuppli is also on the editorial board of the journals Sight and Second Nature. So the idea is we'll have a conversation around the least of all possible evils, Eyal's latest book. We'll open up to some questions to you as well. And then after the talk, we have a book signing downstairs in the bookshop. So hopefully you can join us there as well. Thank you very much to our speakers. Thanks all for coming. And I'll hand over to you, Susan.
Great, thank you very much. So wonderful to be here. And it's a real pleasure, I have to say, to have an opportunity to participate in this conversation with Eyal, who I've known for quite some time, worked with for quite some time. Certainly first as a PhD student under Eyal's supervision, and now as a colleague within a European Research Council project called Forensic Architecture, the space of law in war. And but in particular, I've been a material witness of sorts to the various kinds of sort of permutations of the materials that eventually made it into this book. And so it's been a real treat to watch and to observe the kind of evolution of Eyal's thinking, the kind of recalibration of the arguments over time, and to have an opportunity to participate in this launch today. So, terrific. Thanks so much, Eyal, for allowing me to be a part of this kind of really fascinating kind of journey that resulted in this text. So what we thought we would do would, Eyal, in order to generate, I think in order to have a kind of meaningful conversation, it makes sense for Eyal to unpack some of the kind of key concepts that are operating in his book. So what he'll do is read short segments of the book. There'll obviously be some images. I have certain questions that I'd like to raise, or and after that we'll open it up to questions from everybody. But I think it makes sense to begin with Eyal presenting some of the kind of operative concepts that he's working through.
So, thank you, Susan, and to everybody in the ICA that made it possible. And in fact, I think that I would like to start by saying that my thinking around the question of the lesser evil that made it into the title as the least of all possible evils. I'll tell you why, actually. Also, the title takes that form of in putting the argument in that way. In fact, I need it, Susan. I need it because I'd like to read from it. Is a questioning of my own practice, and my own practice as an architect, obviously, kind of working in the world, and with all its frictions and contradictions that practice by definition brings, compromises and evaluation of situations. But in particular, in relation to work that I was doing for the human rights community in Israel-Palestine originally, and a kind of a realization that started growing as to the political limit of thinking politics or political situation from the frame of human rights and later human rights law and international humanitarian law. Right? These are frames that have a certain kind of, there's a certain trade-off that is being made here. Let's start with kind of international law. If you somehow want to create a certain effect, political effect, in the form of political pressure that sometimes have teeth, or you want to insist on taking a general to court or a politician, you need to enter into the following trade-off. You need to say, I'm operating now within the frame of the law. I'm limiting the question from its, let's say, much longer historical, political implications into a kind of a question of technicality. Has this action in war been in violation of Article 4 of the Fifth Geneva Convention or something like that, right? So you reduce the kind of the political reading into a kind of a technical question, but that allows you a certain force to act with. So what is this trade-off and how does it operate? How does those dilemmas in fact translate to political decision? What are their effect on the ground? And that led me, so, you know, and I was constantly facing those issues because on the one hand, I was writing my first book, with Verso also, A Civilian Occupation. It later led to the second book, Hollow Land, where kind of much more historical, theoretical, political readings of the situation. Whereas my work for human rights groups were much more technical, right? In what way that line drawn on a map, doing that kind of twist and turn, becomes a violation of international humanitarian law, i.e. a violation of the law of war, and something that could potentially be, you know, somebody could go, if, you know, I mean, we were far away from that, but theoretically somebody could go to prison for doing that. And our intention at the time was kind of to really shift the field of culpability from politicians and soldiers onto architects also. But then you're looking at very, very minute things. Somebody sitting at her office or his office is making a kind of a twist and turn of a shape, and by doing that, crosses and violates the law. So the book started really with exploration of kind of what happens to politics that makes this kind of move necessary. And where, you know, kind of let's say the previous generation to activists that I was part of in relation to the conflict of Palestine, who were parts of all sorts of Marxist groups, of a different splinter group from the PLO. I was also a member of them really at the end of kind of the, let's say, the public relevance of these groups. PFLP, DFLP, Democratic Front for Liberation of Palestine, Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. It's kind of like the generation, kind of like, I don't know, even people like 10 years older than me, right? And and my generation was the first one that kind of started to deal with human rights issues. So what happened in the process where a certain utopian drive for political transformation that sees a new world possible and that tries to work towards what he defined as the good, shift for the amelioration or moderation of evil, right? Where the lesser evil somehow, in a kind of, in a period where utopia somehow disappears from the political lexicon, replaces the notion of the good, right? So in a sense, I was entering into that question with this book, looking at the limits of my own work. No? Again, I would insist, no, I was also writing historical, theoretical, wider spectrum things, but for operation, it was somehow that frame that was more relevant. So what happens, and what exactly is the lesser evil? I mean, somehow, it's a very old question, politically, philosophically, theologically, almost. No, I mean the question really emerges for the first time with a Christian scholar, a North African Christian scholar called Sant Agustin, in the 4th century, and it is the problem really that emerges in a rather similar moment of the kind of a loss of utopia within the kind of the world of Christian thought. No? So that, let's say, the Pauline, St. Paul's prohibition on doing evil so that good will come is replaced with the questions of government. No? I mean, at Augustine time, Christianity has to start governing people, institutions, places, etc. And therefore, when you are in the world and starting to govern, a certain set of compromises and evaluation of goods and evil has to enter. And that is the moment, I think, where in that context, the question of ethics, which is the question of good and evil, in fact, takes on the form of an economy of less and more. Right? Augustine somehow breaks away from a kind of a worldview in which the devil and evil is simply the opposite and as power as God. So God is all good, the devil is all evil, right? And you have that. And kind of argues that in fact, if that would have been the case, evil would be as perfect as good, or the devil would be as perfect as God. And the question of evil, as he defined it, is always measured on its imperfection, on its distance from the good. The question of evil is always a question of more or less. It's never a question of absolute. There is no absolute evil. There's only absolute good, right? So we have a kind of a problem of an economy. And the minute we have a problem of an economy, you need to start compare things to other things. You need to say, what is better? To kill a robber or to save the people that you would save? Or all sorts of other things become convertible. Not, this is what I mean in economy, no? A kind of a conversion rate between incompatible things, no? That has to start. And therefore, we are entering a world in which evil is always a question of calculation. There's always an economy. Okay? So this is somehow how the book starts, and with this question, and with a very famous scene of destruction. Of course, a lot of the physical evidence and the issues discussed in this book are issues of destruction, destruction of architecture mainly. So I started the book with a scene like that. I will read the beginning. How are we doing for time? Is it a good idea?
Yeah, perfect.
Sorry, but before I do it, I will take you directly into the present. We were talking about calculation. And this is the image that starts the book, really, on the front page. This is an image of a man in Israel called Yitzhak ben Israel, who is both a mathematician, a scientist, and a military advisor. And in fact, what this man does is presenting a formula for how many people will Israel have to kill in a Hamas organization in order for that organization to collapse, right? So you start seeing that kind of political issue taking on the form of calculation and an economy. And he arrived at the conclusion in this graph that if Israel would kill 25% of all activists in Hamas, about 80% that the organization would collapse, if you kill 50, 100% that the organization would collapse, and this is because the loss of information and knowledge within the kind of the systemic logic of an organization. So that is a kind of an image of calculation that so somehow brings us immediately to the present. Having survived the butchery of a Gerson battle, Candide escapes the army and comes upon his longtime tutor Pangloss. The two decide to set out on a sea journey. A tempest wrecked their ship, killing almost all aboard. Pangloss and Candide washed ashore in Lisbon upon a plank. Quote, hardly do they set foot in a city that they feel the earth tremble beneath them. A boiling sea rises in a port and shatters the vessel lying at anchor. Great sheets of flame and ash cover the streets and public squares. Houses collapse, roof topple onto foundation, at foundational level in turn, 30,000 inhabitants without regards to age or sex are crushed beneath the ruins. End quote. But Master Pangloss, emerging from under a pile of the city's rubble, drawing of which later generation will regard as the first media representation of a distant catastrophe. I think you know Jacques-Philippe Lebas, first forensic of architectural destruction is done at the wake of the Lisbon disaster. And these are the images that start circulating, because they're etchings, they start circulating throughout Europe and creating that kind of new phenomena that now we regard as that kind of the humanitarian sentiment of identification with suffering of distant people that we do not know, people not from our family, city or nation in that sense. So Pangloss argues that there is no effect without a cause. He explains to Candide that divine calculations, obscure to the human mind, mean that all that happened is for the very best. For Pangloss, of course, all was always for the best, in the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire's grotesque satirical adventure novel continues across seas and continents, witnessing the cruelty, violence, and destruction of both human and divine order. Of course, Candide, as you know, was written in the wake of the 1755 earthquake in Lisbon. Sort of, as I said, a moment where another kind of point in the sort of theology of the lesser evil kind of starts in the argument. And you know also that Voltaire makes fun of Leibniz in this, of Leibniz's argument. The sequence of devastation described above prompted Voltaire to challenge and ridicule Leibnizian optimism with it the concept of necessity, which implies that destructive events somehow serve an invisible and mysterious purpose in a world in which the relationship between good and evil is always optimal. Leibniz himself has been buried for 2 decades when the Lisbon earthquake struck. But it was he who has proposed the scheme of the best of all possible worlds in order to reconcile all apparent evils in the world, floods, starvation, storm, now like to refer to as emergencies, with the idea of divine providence, which is necessarily omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, all-powerful, knowing, and good. Leibniz's attempt to solve this old-age theological aporia involved the conception of a God as an economist that manages the world by solving a minimum problem in the calculus of variation. Right? So what God does, God is a kind of perfect mathematician who instantly can calculate, compare all possible worlds, and would choose always the one out of infinite number of possible worlds in which the level of evil is at minimum. Right? Again, the question of good and evil becomes a kind of an economy and a matter of calculation. And it is these calculations that return again and again and again in the book, in the secular rather than theological sense. Another thing that how the Leibnizian God actually undertake that instantaneous calculation is by looking at the smallest unit possible that Leibniz called monads. Monads are those substances in which all earthly relations are saturated. So, in a sense, Leibniz's God is a kind of a forensic guy, looking at the tiniest units and see the entire world from it. So again, the question of calculation and the question of materiality, the 2 questions that structure that book, are already present within this narrative. But as the general outlook of, I'm skipping a lot. Let's say to here. Unlike the calculation of a God seen by the philosopher and theologians of the 18th century as a perfect mathematician who could undertake instantaneous calculation and immediately arrive at a precise result, mere human must of course guess, speculate, and hedge the risk as they proceed toward the future as the blind leading the blind. It is for this reason that they ceaselessly seek to develop and perfect all sorts of technologies and techniques that might allow them to calculate the effects of violence and harness its consequences. It is these techniques and technologies, apparatuses and spatial arrangements that are at the heart of this book. Okay? How do we calculate violence? What are the means that we use to do it, and what are the kind of, and how do we operate based on this calculation? Through them, i.e. through these technologies, Pangloss' Leibnizian scheme of the best of all possible world reemerges in the progressive tradition of liberalism. Here, in its secular form, political rather than metaphysical, a similar structure of the argument set up the sphere of morality as a set of calculation aimed to approximate the optimum proportion between common goods and necessary evils. But as the general outlook of liberalism shifted from Voltaire's focus on a greater good and the responsibility of government to increase happiness to the greatest number of people, to the liberal canon of just war and their increasingly sophisticated technologies for minimizing the numbers of necessary corpses, the search for the best of all possible worlds started giving ground to the present neo-Panglossian least of all possible evils. So this is really kind of the setting up of the question of calculation of violence, calculation of good and evil, and materiality. So just, Susan, maybe you want to...
Well, I wonder whether it would be useful to talk about, discuss what the number 3.14 means. I'm sure you remember the discussion. Yeah. I think it's quite useful to have that as a very kind of practical example of mathematical proportionality.
So the book is structured as a kind of a series of episodes where contemporary calculations and analysis are actually taking place. So in Israel, in one of the middle of the previous decade, there was a meeting between Israeli generals, lawyers, and philosophers of ethics to define what is the acceptable number of civilian casualties that the state should allow while killing a single Palestinian militant in a military operation. So already you see that there is a kind of an economy. No? They allow what is the number of civilian, innocent casualties that would be worth the death of a single militant. That is part of a principle that is called in international law proportionality, which is in fact the principle of this economy. I mean, you hear it all the time when we protest violence by saying it's a disproportional attack. Proportionality is a rather late arrival into international law, only at the end of the 70s, and it is introduced by a single word that is put into a legal clause, and that is the word excessive. It is, previously, it is forbidden for military to kill civilians or make damage to civilian properties. After the introduction of this word, if they are excessive in relation to the military aim. By the word excessive, you start creating an economy between desired effect and undesired consequences. No? So it is within that frame that all sort of question of how many civilians could we kill in order to save or in order to produce the military effect of killing one militant. So in one experiment that I mentioned before, those lawyers and philosophers and generals meet in a room, and each one writes secretly on a note the number of civilian casualties that he would accept as permissible. They put all the notes in some pot, they mix it up, they take them out, they make the average, and the average ended up as 3.14. For anyone that does a little mathematics, know that this is the pi, which is the relationship between the radius and the circumference of a circle. But there are other calculations. I would read another moment of such calculation by another Israeli lawyer who is asked, how many, and this is in relation to Gaza, how many civilians are we allowed to kill in that particular situation. So that is the main, he is the chief lawyer for the Israeli army, and really gave me a rather rare interview for this book. He says, proportionality is a complex logic with many variables, but how do you compare these? There is no choice but to ask the question, compare and calculate. Proportionality does not tell us what to include in the equation. What is the equation and what is the exchange rate? Should a man of combatant age be counted as a civilian? If so, does he count for more or for less? How do you calculate women in relation to men? How do you count the death of children? Does one dead child equal one dead grown-up, or does he equal 5 grown-ups? As a lawyer, I need numbers to work with. I need thresholds in order to instruct the soldiers, right, etc., etc., etc. It goes on. I mean, it's really an awful quote that kind of shows you how the logic of economy, of the lesser evil is structuring, not justifying war. I'm not talking anywhere in the book about a kind of rhetorical justification of violence, but the very way by which violence is exercised. What is the logic of this violence? And you can see the kind of the Panglossian, Voltaire's sort of tongue-in-cheek critique of Leibniz, and that kind of logic in which all sort of evil events are calculated.
Maybe this would be give me an opportunity to, in some way, to jump ahead in your text, because I was interested in this notion of excessive force that was just mentioned, and in part, I was trying to think about the ways, and you mentioned Augustine, so I was thinking, does the lesser evil require, if you will, the baseline of evil in order to produce its economy of calculation? Evil in this case might be understood as the politiques de pire, it could always be worse, not necessarily a kind of absolute evil. So this is a kind of bracketed question in terms of what is the baseline that we require in order to calculate the lesser evil, and because that which exceeds the lesser, anything in excess of a kind of what is deemed to be a kind of acceptable risk, proportionality, etc., produces an excess. In mathematics we might call that a kind of remainder. As Eyal starts to move through the book, brings in various figures, in particular Ronnie Brauman, but at this point I wanted to bring in Adi Ophir, where you talk about a book he's written on the order of evil, and he talks about the kind of very unpredictable nature of violence. And it's precisely its unpredictable nature that in some way also produces a kind of excess, and or it produces something that can't actually be calculated. It operates in excess of the calculable. And actually a quote that Eyal makes in his book is where he says, "That which is incalculable, uncountable, and immeasurable is also ungovernable." So there's this kind of strange détournement that happens in the sense that that which is in excess also in some way stands as the space of potential out of which new political configurations or insurrectionary assemblages kind of might emerge. So I think I'd be interested in hearing you sort of talk about this, sort of the excess as both that in which we might locate something like the concept of total war, but it's precisely the excess that also perhaps enables a kind of new politics to emerge.
So originally, or initially, in relation to the benchmark against which all evil is measured, is, in the field of international law and human rights, this is very much the Jewish genocide of the Second World War. That is defined as almost in the same way that for the political philosophers of modernity, the state of nature functions. For Locke, for example, the state of nature is the situation against which all politics need to be organized. Arendt also kind of makes, there's a discussion of that moment of the threshold of this evil in Ronnie Brauman kind of reading of Arendt. Ronnie Brauman is the president of MSF, and we are in Ethiopia in one of his moments, and then he's thinking through a quote that Arendt has in her book on Eichmann, or is it on a book in a book on totalitarianism? Sorry, she says that when the worst, she's speaking about the concept of the worst. When the worst has been recorded in history, the worst possibility thus far, the worst kind of violence thus far, its potential or its likelihood, so she said, its likelihood to re-emerge is becoming increased. Right? It's ever more likely for it to happen when it is already recorded in history, right? So if something like the Holocaust has happened and is recorded in history, it is ever more likely for this to reoccur. Right? And I think it's around that kind of shifting threshold of the worst that the whole field of human rights organizes itself. So again, it kind of takes the Holocaust as the kind of the worst possible evil and start moderating and organizing the entire political field as as kind of attempts to stop any slippery slope towards that thing. Right? So it loses its kind of conception of a good, of a common good, of something that we would strive towards and seek to moderate these events. Now, and within that, and therefore all those thresholds are kind of being put, like the threshold that is discussed in a chapter, in one of the last chapter when in the American bombing of Iraq as part of the shock and awe campaign, the American proportionality analysis is 29 to 1. They're saying they're allowing their bombers to kill up to 29 Iraqi civilians for every military leader of the Ba'ath Party that they would kill in this attack. But I think I missed the second part of your question. I really forgot.
I was asking because precisely the excess is aligned with that, which is ungovernable, in some way also becomes potentially a kind of space of revolution or where a new political kind of configuration might emerge.
Sure. No, I mean, I think that in describing that kind of economy and that kind of means of government through the economizing of violence, the economizing of evil, let's say, the way that the book at the end suggests the kind of to think a departure from it is the necessary thing is to exit that economy. Exiting that economy is either by putting oneself outside of the possibility to be calculated. No? So, for example, it contests all sorts of ways by which, after a long chapter on Gaza, the way that well-meaning humanitarians operate there is actually by continuously calculating the number of people, calculating the number of calories that go into it, calculating the number of kilowatt in the thing, and in the current that is necessary for them to operate, and suggests that politics, in fact, perhaps by definition, has to be the shattering of this economy. But it's not always that easy, to say what you need to do is to shatter that economy. Because sometimes everything that you do, and you operate politically, or you still strategically use the kind of the platforms of international law and human rights to engage situation in Palestine and elsewhere, it is about working within and outside of that economy, working within and outside the field of human rights, for example, or international law.
At an earlier moment, I recall you describing this kind of regulatory system, which the ways in which it's both kind of sustains and suspends the occupation, allowing life to endure at a kind of a state of kind of toleration, and that sort of. So now I'm wondering, like the kind of the necessity for kind of breaking that. At an earlier moment, you were suggesting or made a kind of provocative claim that in fact it would be to ratchet that up to a kind of the level of the absolutely kind of intolerable, and that the regulatory system was actually what enabled the occupation to endure precisely through its kind of very
Calibration.
precise calibrations, and that so at that moment you're suggesting that the breakage occurs through kind of pushing it to a level where life is fundamentally absolutely intolerable, and that was a very kind of provocative statement that you made at that time. And is that would you still be thinking along those terms?
I'll describe a little bit the context of this question. We now in a chapter when we're speaking about the siege of Gaza, and the siege of Gaza is, as you know, now it's a little bit eased, but Gaza is completely surrounded by walls, and if flotillas are trying to get there, Israel would send commandos to. So basically, it's completely insulated. However, it's not in Israeli interest to see mass death of starvation of Palestinians inside. Therefore, they need to enter a very complex field of calculation. In fact, I can show you some of these formulas in relation to this, where all sort of threshold conditions of life are being actually kind of calculated. So first of all, they needed to establish what is the minimum amount of calories that would keep people just barely alive, right? And in order to do that, they employed humanitarians, people that were working in humanitarian missions in Asia and Africa, and we had experience in food provision that could tell the Israeli military that was governing the siege what people need in order to survive. And they said it's 2,100 calories per adult male, 1,700 for female, and children according to gender and age. Okay? So then this is divided into several types of food, calculated as tonnage of trucks, and these are being kind of brought into the strip in order to keep people exactly on that threshold. No? And then some humanitarians in Israel were saying, well, this is far too little calories. 1,000, 2,100, if you do not, and you just multiply it by the number of male, and 1,700 by the number of female, in the strip, would not be enough because we need to take into account loss of food on the way, and uneven distribution, and all sorts of other formulas that are affecting that. And therefore, they were campaigning to increase the number of calories that were going inside. Same for electricity, right? In electricity, Israel undertook a certain kind of inverse Milgram experiment. You know the famous Milgram experiment where supposedly you increase the current to see the effect, or in fact it's a test of the people that increase the current, but it doesn't matter now. Here it was inverse in the sense that the pain over the population of Gaza was inflicted by a gradual reduction of the current. No? So it was reduced initially 5% every week, while the effect of the reduction of the electrical current into Gaza were monitored. So they take 5 down and they see that there is temporary blackouts. Fine. They take another 5 down. You know, the sewage farms start stop working. They take another 5 down. The hospitals stop working, or the morgues in a part of the hospital stop working, etc. And they calibrate in that way that kind of threshold of the tolerable through a kind of a really literal calibration, etc. What I was suggesting or writing was not that I think that that we should increase pain, or in general this would be increase the pain of others for our political gain. That would never, in fact, be my position. But I was also contesting a political action that enters into this calculation, that says, well, we need to increase the current in 35%, or we need to provide this and this more calories, etc. That the minute you enter into that logic, no, you are within it and you're part, you're not outside of violence, you're part of the mechanism of violence. One of the fundamental points of this book is that the moderation of violence is part of the logic of violence. It's not external to violence. You will not say, you know, the military just want to go wild, no, and human rights people reduce it. The kind of devastating effect of violence. But violence in itself operates as an economy of measure, and therefore the human rights group that moderate violence are part of making violence more efficient, right? The very fact that there was a threshold in the run-up to the American invasion of Iraq of 39-1 is a new thing. There wasn't a threshold in previous wars. They wanted to kill somebody, they would drop, they would ruin the entire neighborhood, you know. There's no proportionality really didn't figure. The minute it figures, it needs to have numbers. You need to calculate it. In order to achieve that number, you need to translate it into an engineering category. You need to know how much explosives on a building that is supported by this kind of structural frame, and it's this high, and this proportion of glass in the envelope. So the entire question of ethics, of good and evil, becomes an engineering problem. And the engineer becomes the most important figure, both in administering violence and later in reading its consequences.
Yeah, at one point in the section on the ethical governor, you quote a prominent military historian who said who describes contemporary war as social work with guns. I think it actually would be important in terms of the kind of understanding of your book to also, I think, return to Ronnie Brauman and the chapter on Arent in Ethiopia, just to unpack to look at the kind of exactly what you've just articulated, the kind of both the complicity of relief and humanitarian agencies within a kind of within a crisis situation, and also the concept of humanitarian space that has also developed there. Because we are about 5 after 2. Should we have the last 15, 20 minutes for open questions? Just so we have another, I'd say another 10 minutes between the two of us.
Oh, do we have another 10 minutes? Okay,
yeah.
Great. Yeah. So the question of social work with guns, this is really, if you read contemporary military manuals for work across what Derek Gregory called the colonial present in Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, you see that the question of humanitarianism and human rights has become a military jargon now. So the military believes that in order to govern more effectively in areas where they need to win over these hearts and minds that they are often referring to, they have to reduce civilian casualties, because civilian casualties are bad for business, for the military. It creates antagonism and etc., etc. So somehow the military started using proportionality and other categories of international law and human rights in order to internalize them, in order to make itself more efficient and appearing to be kind of on behalf of the population itself. The second chapter in the book about Ronnie Brauman that Susan mentioned really traces the history of this idea, of the ways in which humanitarians, private humanitarians, or non-Red Cross humanitarians, that start emerging in the wake of the 68 movements. You know that 68 was not only a kind of a protest against the institutions of power, but against the very notion of the left itself as a kind of homogeneous communist party, kind of driven and governed sort of political action, and into all sorts of engagement with the ills of the world on different ways. Environmental movement, gender, racial politics, and humanitarianism emerges also a few years later around the Biafra War as a kind of an attempt by radical doctors at the time, radical French doctors, Bernard Kouchner and others, to engage differently with the question of aid. The problem, they were saying, was that until that point, humanitarians such as the Red Cross operated with the following equation or deal. They would say, we can gain access into war, and in exchange for that, we will never disclose what we have seen, right? So we'll never disclose any mistreatment or any kind of problems that we saw beyond the lines, and so you can trust us in getting there. Around the time, a very famous study of the Red Cross is published that shows that the Red Cross was in Auschwitz in 1943 or 4, have seen and knew about the extermination, but was content simply with kind of writing an internal memo and report and not contested that issue. So the new generation of humanitarians emerged exactly against that. They said, we are doctors during the day and witnesses during the night. This is how they politicized themselves through the concept of témoignage, of testimony, that comes into being. But very soon, and this is the whole scene that I'm unpacking, they're seeing that their testimony need not be against other people, right? We are now Ethiopia, 1985. Of course, Mengistu and his Red Terror are displacing millions of people from northern Ethiopia to southern Ethiopia. Many people die, etc., etc. But it is not, Ronnie Brauman realized, the Ethiopian government that he needs to testify against, but it is a realization that it is the own work of humanitarianism that produced all that killing and death. Why? Because the humanitarians were there opening some relief centers. A lot of people were simply migrating there, moving there to get shelter and food. From there, they were in some kind of concentration camp situation from which they were deported into the south of the country. I.e., humanitarianism need to testify against itself, or the kind of the Maoist category of autocritique. They need to turn critique inward. And in order to turn it inward, rather than kind of testify for the ills of the world of what other people doing, this kind of anti-totalitarian gesture of humanitarianism, it is about their own involvement and their own the potential harm that humanitarians could produce in situation. And the book is full of different scenarios and examples where actually the presence of humanitarians in a particular situation runs counter to the very basic interest of people in need, and that is to survive. The more you treat, the more people will die. And in that chapter also there is a kind of a very powerful proposal by Ronnie Brauman, that was enacted, of humanitarian withdrawal, of understanding that there is a situation beyond which your presence on the ground creates more damage than good, and you leave your patients. And leaving their patients is giving them more chances somehow of survival than staying with them. So that kind of idea that absenting from action could be the best possible thing to do in that particular situation.
I mean, yeah, that's such a kind of radical interjection for him to make on that part, and I was wondering, sort of maybe my last question, and then we open it up, because there's at that, in terms of a kind of discussion around our understanding of the humanitarian present, specifically vis-a-vis these the ways in which there's a kind of collusion that takes place between human rights and humanitarian law with state practices. And you say they do not provide adequate tools to break away with these regimes and struggle against their neo-colonial projects. And so, could you speculate, or do you have any ideas in terms of how might you understand a humanitarian future, not a different version of the humanitarian present, but a humanitarian future in which a project that you're working on right now, we're both working on, which is forensics, is there a way in which you can imagine a radically different, radical in the same way that Ronnie Brownman's proposal to actually withdrawal becomes a kind of radical way to actually, a radical kind of proposition for refusing a certain complicity and collusion? What might a humanitarian future be in your kind of conceptual schema?
I think that, well, I mean, the book does not claim that humanitarian aid must stop in all situations.
No, of course not, yeah.
It is asking us to think the particular kind of force field, political analysis that needs to understand whether and how it can operate. But I think very much that somehow a kind of, again, a radical break from the world of human rights and humanitarianism, what I call the humanitarian present, and the world of politics has to happen in order for politics to operate again. So the problem, I think, is humanitarians that want to work politically, right, through humanitarianism. And that we see through the problem of testimony and through the problem that state humanitarian, political humanitarianism ended up in wars, right? In wars such as the Kosovo War, or even in the Libya conflict now. I think that humanitarian, this is a very different question for humanitarians and for human rights people. I think if we're talking about medical humanitarianism, I think it's enough to be a good doctor. I think the question need to remain clinical rather than political, whereas politics need to operate outside of this frame. So, in a sense, the attempt of Kushner to politicize humanitarianism after Biafra, I think, has completely failed because it produced a kind of a beige version of both humanitarianism and politics, both without effect. And I think that the absolute kind of professionalization of humanitarianism would allow even those people to produce politics somewhere else, in a different platform. It will be as ridiculous to ask our humanitarianism to be political or revolutionary as asking your doctor here in a London hospital to give you lectures on Marx when you go to have treatment. So I really do not think that this is the right way to do. I think also the question of the professionalization of humanitarianism allow, paradoxically, the politics of those people receiving aid to become the important politics that is discussed, right? Now, it is not really, in my opinion, important what the politics of some people in France in the early 70s is as they go, or in the 80s is as they go to a highland plateau in northern Ethiopia there. It is important what the local politics in the place is. And I think that somehow by evacuating the humanitarian project of politics, you allow the kind of the politics on the ground to manifest itself much stronger. And I see it very, very clearly in the question of Palestinian refugees, and this is how the book somehow ends, because it is, for years, was the conception, a certain kind of version of the Marxist politics of the war, so politics de pire, that the refugee camp, the Palestinian refugee camp, have to remain in a situation of misery, of poverty, and the sewage has to run overground, etc., in order to buttress the political subjectivity of refuginess, which is the revolutionary actor of the Palestinian revolution, right? If you would create a kind of a well catered for refugee, she or he would lose their political desire. And I think it was, for years, it was a wrong approach to the question of the refugees. No? It created a false economy, and it translated a political question, a political right, the right of return, for example, as a kind of architectural or economical or a social problem, i.e. the problem of wealth or the architectural standard of the building. And together also with colleagues of mine in the practice DAR that we run in Betzahor, Palestine, and especially Sen Hilal, who is working for UNRWA, understands that in fact, by simply providing for the strength of refugee communities in Palestine, without any kind of the indoctrination or political project that would come with it. Usually those political projects would be very much along liberal democracy, etc., allow actually the kind of the refugees to become stronger politically in this situation. No? So that kind of improvement of conditions, it's not running against the political right, but becomes the condition for politics to actually play out much more powerfully. And this, I think, is a kind of a moment where the book ends with a proposal, let's say, as you say, for the humanitarian future.
Yes, exactly. This is the time that we need to open it up to questions or comments. Please.
Thanks so much for that. I found it very convincing. I'm struck, by the way, with a parallel with an argument in the animal rights movement, or rather an argument by some of those in the animal rights movement against animal welfareism or against humane societies and so on. Our basic argument being, if you campaign for animals to be tortured a bit less, then you're basically campaigning for their torture to be prolonged, which is, I think, an interesting, convincing argument. Parallel with yours is interesting. I was struck in the examples you gave that you mostly focused on Palestine, the occupation of Palestine and the attack on Iraq. And those examples, perhaps partly therefore, were extremely convincing. I wondered whether your argument that we should completely exit the economy of violence would be so convincing if it were applied to certain other cases where there was less of a clear international criminality or dubious political will at the basis of it. So you mentioned in passing the case of Libya. Now, how do things look in the case of Libya? In the case of Libya, for example, we have a UN Security Council resolution, we have the General Assembly backing it, we have a clear case of the responsibility to protect. We also have a powerful political argument in the sense that if we had allowed Gaddafi to crush Benghazi, then it's quite possible that the entire forward momentum of the Arab Spring would have been halted or reversed. And for those who think, as I do, and perhaps many of us do, that the Arab Spring is an absolutely tremendous uprising, a very wonderful development on balance of the last, an extraordinary development of our time, that would have been a terrible thing. So how do things look when it comes to a case like Libya? Because in the case of Libya, for example, you have the same guys in NATO making calculations of how much collateral damage is acceptable and so on. Is it implicit in your argument that any time that such calculations are made, then we have completely gone wrong? Or does your argument only work for interventions that are basically wrong or criminal or unethical or politically bad in the first place?
Yeah, I think that, well, I mean, the question of Libya, as I understand it, is somehow very different. Because we have the Benghazi situation where a kind of a specter of a possible genocide or massacre allows the sort of the mobilization of force that is later completely being used for political purpose. We have a total blurring of the, let's say, the humanitarian and the political reasons for violence. Now, I think that the question of humanitarianism here has been kind of purely a kind of a smokescreen. So, and then you would say, you know, you would have the same question to answer in Syria. Are you going to use or abuse humanitarian principles in order to allow a kind of a legitimacy of a military attack to out Assad? From that, you can argue in the same way that by turning Syria around, you create a wedge between Iran and Hezbollah, right? And there's a kind of a geopolitical motivation to that. But that geopolitical motivation also, and the kind of the whole nature of the attack, takes something extremely important out of this conflict, and that is the autonomy of and the responsibility of the people there on the ground, both to claim for the right and to face the consequences. And that is what we admire them for, the people in Syria. And I don't think that, in a sense, an intervention in that would perhaps technically, yes, would kind of accelerate the regime change, would take out an awful dictator out of the equation, right? But would not be at all in the same spirit of liberation that other places have undertaken. So, you know, I would not, in that sense, I'm not for the Libya intervention, was never actually for it or supported it, and definitely not in the case of Syria.
On that note, I just wanted to thank you for the timeliness of your book, which I've enjoyed reading enormously. Partly because of the way in which human rights discourse itself become a kind of conduit through which liberalism reconfigures itself. Or put it another way, the way in which democracy ends revolutions. And we talk of the Arab Spring in a kind of world in which the notion of a spring is sort of somewhere else. And I think the arrogance of a new imperialism, if you like, a sort of human rights imperialism, is very much at the back of my mind as I go to work. And I have Southern Africa at the back of my mind. I have the city of Johannesburg, if you like, yeah. which is on one hand very kind of opens up a possibility of a new Afropolitan poetic emerging, and at the same time it's built on a kind of legacy of kind of misery and pain, which nobody can actually walk around. So I kind of welcome very much some of the insights you make, although you're looking very much around Palestine, but I can think of a number of other geographies in which the question of the kind of like reconfiguration of the new humanism might emerge. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, at a certain point, isn't Ronnie Brauman actually starts to understand his project as a kind of form of neoliberalism? So yeah, which does raise the kind of question in terms of what the kind of recent transformations in kind of global economics and that kind of calculative register, how that is actually also going to potentially produce realignments within the humanitarian kind of project. But we have time for other questions. Yeah.
Just a sort of quick question. I was just sort of made curious about how you sort of think about numbers by some of the things, and sort of quantifications in general by some of the things you said. You talked about, you introduced these permissible death ratios and the sort of calorie counts and all these kinds of things and dealt with them in a really interesting way. but I'm wondering whether you see, or whether perhaps you haven't thought about this, but if you have, whether you see sort of your treatment of these sort of quantifications in the same line as these sort of condemnations of the sort of terrible modernist sort of state reductivism of numbers and of quantities, or whether you see numbers as actually being something quite sort of helpful, something quite useful, and something with sort of, you know, quite a lot of radical political potential embedded in. Because when we sort of critique reductions in terms of numbers, we also use those numbers to make that critique, and at the same time we can offer our own quantifications that can contradict it. So is there something good in reducing things to numbers?
You know, I mean, if the book's title would be what I wanted it to be, you know, I have my versa representative, it would be 665, the lesser evil, which is obviously one less than the number of the beast, but kind of like opening up the idea of kind of little, you know, the lesser evil being a kind of a calibration of that. No, I think that, as I said, I think it is wrong for all, in all sort of chapters, for humanitarians in court to argue on the level of what is the right calories that we need, how to calibrate it. I don't think that it is, at least within my kind of understanding, political understanding in the book, there is no wizardry in the number. I'm very curious by what you say. Maybe you know something better, but in fact, a kind of an attempt to break away from, as much as possible, from that economy, no? Because you've been drawn into it, right? I mean, there's another narrative goes through the book. We haven't discussed it, and that is the question of materiality. So the moment that calculations start emerging really as the kind of, let's say, apparatus of government in that sense, the question of materiality emerges in a different way. No? And I'm looking at the transformation in political and human rights epistemologies from the testimonial, right? I mean, human rights and humanitarians, as you see, are in a Brauman case, no, born around the kind of the question of identification, empathy, testimony, multiple truths, narrative, all this kind of postmodern moment of human rights and humanitarianism that creates a different historical epistemology, no, is replaced with a certain kind of materiality, as also forensics start replacing testimony, no, material forensics, through, again, the material emerges in this book only as a problem of calculation. An object is object if it could be calculated, no? And all apparatuses and things and materials that are there are kind of subject to calculation, are the means by which calculations take place. So, you know, the same guy who was doing the 29-to-1 proportionality analysis in the Shokenor in Iraq, no, is the guy that later became the forensic of ruins, no, in the last chapter. He's the guy that just reverses his relation to matter. At the beginning, he's the designer of ruins, right? He designed how the ruin should look like in order to produce that mathematical ratio. And then in another war, he leaves the army, joins Human Rights Watch, and he becomes a kind of forensic architect in that case.
Literally the same person?
Yeah, it's the same person. Yeah, and I mean the whole chapter is kind of the story of that inversion, how that inversion is possible. And two things come to mind. One is there is no inversion. The military is already internalized human rights to such a degree that moving from the military to UN or human rights environment does not necessitate any change in your methodology. What it does for the military is proportionality analysis. For the military, 29-for-1 is the acceptable one. For a human rights organization, maybe 14 is the right threshold, no? And second is what binds, what the hinge is the materiality itself, right? It is the ruin that he makes that becomes the ruin that he reads, no? So the kind of calculation, or the material objective world become a field of calculation, operates as quantifiable, calculated commodities, objects, etc. No, we calculate calories, foodstuff, medical aid, kilowatt, ruins, etc. All that is entering into that kind of conversion rate of proportionality, where everything that are incompatible could be calculated. Another incompatible thing, no? I mean, how do you calculate? There's a scene in the book about how they calculate what I call in the book the best of all possible walls. No? So they sit on a model trying to design the wall in Palestine, right? And humanitarians try to push it a little bit towards the Israeli border. And the military said, no, that's too dangerous. We want to put it a little bit more into Palestinian area. Then they say, no, but then you lose too many fields, and then, you know. So, but in all level, that kind of push and pull ratio calculates tonnage of olive oil or wheat or plums against the security of a driver, taking a left turn. How do you measure that against that, right? There's a kind of, well, I mean, I guess.
Nevertheless, these decisions have to be made, right?
And they have, yeah.
Yeah. So, but I don't quite understand what you're saying to someone who's, for example, a practicing politician. What are you recommending them to do? Should they just toss a coin, or what, when they're trying to make these kind of decisions?
No. I mean, I think that, the book speaks to humanitarians and human rights people, no? And speaks about my own experience and problem. And in many of those issues, in the wall issue, I write also in the book, I was involved myself. So I'm not kind of like sitting from the outside and saying, But I think that the political action must always be outside of that field of calculation. If I am an activist in Israel-Palestine, I believe in a one-state solution, right, or fight for that, that is a kind of a truth like that, which is incalculable, undesignable, need to be articulated. So, and indeed, as I started this lecture, I'm saying, at some points, you need, in order to get teeth, or bite, you need to operate within that frame. But if you do not simultaneously operate within a political, historical frame, I think all is lost. Seriously, all is lost.
So to move beyond
the
that.
problem of politicians is the problem of politicians. This is, politics is, of course, it's about the realm of the possible, and how to do that, and how to arrive there. Even quoting at some point Lenin, the one, the person of the politics of fear. The worse, the better. Actually, you always have people more to the left of you. And Lenin signed an agreement at the end of the First World War where he accommodates the Western powers. And those people come and say, you sold us. And he said, not, objecting to compromise in principle is childish, and I agree with that. It's not. I don't have that. I'm not simply mobilizing kind of abstract utopia against the friction of life, but I'm just wondering, a very practical question: how do you operate in a situation if you are an Israeli anti-colonial activist? How do you operate? How do you mobilize both this and that? And that is, that is the search that is within that book somehow. Yeah?
So when you're in a situation when there is this wall and you have the cars and how they turn on one side and then the fields on the other side, what is the thing to do to just resist all measurements, to sabotage all the calculators? I mean, what's the
in this situation, I think absolutely you should not enter a negotiation on your own dispossession, on the level of your own dispossession. If somebody comes to you, to your house, and says, "I'm going to take most of it," let's now start negotiating. This is the kind of thing you just resist. And another project that project, but kind of form of political action that I think is much more fruitful if you talk about the wall, and that is your question, is those binational demonstration along the path of the wall in Berlin. People that go and shake the wall and stand together, Israelis and Palestinians, along the path of that bloody thing, and not accept it as a material reality.
I just want to make, it seems to me you're making the case for a moral argument, fundamentally, rather than an argument of statistics or of numbers.
Or the
Political,
necessity,
yeah.
Necessity. I think we have to wrap up, but yeah, absolutely. To question what role morality plays within the kind of political economy of calculation in some way, I see is where I would situate Eyal's project. And also in terms of you, just to wrap up, the way in which you argue that proportionality becomes the very means by which violence, the law, and political meanings are translated, I would say a kind of radical reconfiguration of that would be for my understanding of your own work actually in some way functions precisely as a kind of to translate that triangulation of forces for us, but in a radically kind of different way. So I would just like to thank everybody for their questions and their time, and and to thank Eyal in particular and the ICA for launching the book here in London. And we'll go downstairs soon for the official signing. Yeah.
Thank you very much to Susan as well for